The hospital was a place of routine, a world of fluorescent lights and antiseptic smells, where time seemed to stretch endlessly. For me, it was a necessary inconvenience. My health had taken an unexpected turn, and I found myself here for regular checkups. I wasn't looking for anything beyond a diagnosis and a plan. That changed the day I met him. He was the ward boy assigned to the general care floor, moving with an air of quiet confidence. His name tag read Arjun, but the way he carried himself made it unnecessary. Everyone knew who he was. With his quick smile and the ease with which he connected with patients, Arjun stood out in a place defined by monotony. Our first interaction was unremarkable at first glance. He knocked softly before entering my room, clipboard in hand, his presence exuding a professionalism that put me at ease. "Good morning," he said, his voice warm. "I'm here to check on you." I nodded, offering a polite but guarded smile. As he adjusted the four-stand by my bed, his movements were careful, almost tender. "You've got a strong pulse," he remarked, glancing at the monitor. Then, with a slight tilt of his head, he added, "Not bad for someone who looks like they'd rather be anywhere else." I couldn't help but chuckle, a sound that felt foreign in the sterile room. "You're not wrong," I replied. His grin widened, and for a moment, the clinical walls around us seemed to fade. Over the next few days, our paths crossed more often. Arjun was always around. Whether it was a routine checkup or simply passing by, he had a knack for timing his presence perfectly. He'd ask me questions that felt too genuine to be routine. "How are you holding up? What do you miss most from home?" At first, I answered cautiously, unsure of his intentions. But his patience and attentiveness began to wear down my defenses. One morning, I caught him humming as he prepared a tray of medication. The tune was familiar, a melody from a song I hadn't heard in years. "You know that one?" I asked, surprising myself. He looked up, startled, before laughing softly. "It's my favorite. Didn't think anyone else remembered it." "It's a classic," I said, the corners of my lips lifting. In those small moments, something unspoken began to grow between us. It was in the way his eyes lingered a second too long, or the slight brush of his hand against mine when he handed me a glass of water. It wasn't overt, but it was there, a spark, a possibility. Still, I couldn't ignore a flicker of doubt. The hospital wasn't a place for personal connections, and yet, Arjun made me feel seen in a way I hadn't in a long time. It left me wondering, was this a fleeting connection born of circumstance, or something more? As I watched him leave the room that day, I realized I didn't have an answer. But I wanted one. Days turned into weeks, and Arjun became more than just a face in a uniform. He was a constant presence, his warmth cutting through the impersonal rhythms of hospital life. With every interaction, I felt a fragile connection taking root, one that both intrigued and unsettled me. It started with small gestures. Arjun would linger during checkups, his casual comments slipping past the professional boundaries that defined our roles. "You're looking better today," he said one morning, his tone carrying a hint of something more. His eyes held mine for a moment longer than necessary, and I felt a flutter of confusion mixed with anticipation. Our conversations grew deeper. He shared snippets of his life, how he had grown up in a small village, dreaming of a bigger world. "I wanted to be a doctor," he admitted one evening, his voice tinged with regret. "But life doesn't always go as planned." I found myself opening up in return, sharing stories I hadn't told anyone in years. "I've always been drawn to people who see the world differently," I confessed one day, surprised by my own candor. "It's rare to meet someone who can make you feel alive." His gaze softened, and he leaned slightly closer, as if drawn by an invisible force. "You shouldn't underestimate yourself," he said quietly. "You've got a light most people spend their whole lives searching for." That moment hung between us, heavy with unspoken possibilities. Yet, neither of us dared to cross the invisible line that kept our connection teetering between professional and personal. But the line grew blurrier with each passing day. One afternoon, I found him waiting by the window in my room, gazing out at the city skyline. "Sometimes I wonder if there's more to life than this," he murmured, his voice almost wistful. I hesitated before responding. "Maybe it's not about finding something more," I said. "Maybe it's about recognizing what's already in front of you." He turned to me, and for the first time, his carefully maintained composure seemed to falter. Maybe you're right, he said, his words laced with an emotion I couldn't quite name. As our bond deepened, I couldn't ignore the growing tension. There were moments when his hand brushed against mine, when his gaze lingered too long, when his laughter felt too intimate for the sterile confines of a hospital. I found myself questioning the boundaries we were tiptoeing around. One evening, as he adjusted my pillow, his fingers grazed my cheek. The touch was fleeting, but it sent a jolt through me. "Sorry," he said, his voice low and uneven. But his eyes betrayed him. There was no mistaking the longing that burned there. I should have felt uneasy, but instead, I was consumed by a desire I hadn't anticipated. Was this connection genuine, or were we both caught in the illusion of an impossible circumstance? I didn't have the answer, but I knew the line between us was dangerously close to disappearing altogether. The connection I felt with Arjun was undeniable, but a lingering unease began to gnaw at the edges of my mind. His smile seemed just a bit too practiced, his stories occasionally inconsistent, as though they'd been polished for effect. Still, I silenced my doubts, choosing to believe in the sincerity of what we shared. One evening, as the ward quieted and the dim glow of bedside monitors replaced the harsh fluorescent lights, I heard hushed voices just outside my room. I recognized Arjun's low timbre, but the other voice, a woman's, was unfamiliar. Their words were muffled, but fragments reached me. "No one can know," she said urgently. Arjun's reply was too soft to catch, but the tone was placating, as though he was trying to calm her. My heart clenched, suspicion clawing its way to the surface. When Arjun entered my room minutes later, his demeanor was as warm and attentive as ever. But for the first time, I couldn't return his smile. The following day, I decided to uncover the truth. My opportunity came during a routine checkup. "Arjun," I began casually, "you mentioned you're not from the city. Do you have family here?" He hesitated, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. "No," he replied after a beat, his tone too smooth. "It's just me." It was a lie. I knew it instinctively. My resolve hardened. Later that week, I overheard a nurse gossiping near the nurses' station. "He's charming, isn't he?" she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "But don't let him fool you. He's got a girlfriend, and a fiancée, if you believe the rumors." The words hit me like a physical blow. My stomach churned as pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The woman from the hallway. The inconsistencies in his stories. The practiced charm that felt too perfect. When Arjun arrived that evening, I was ready. "Who were you talking to outside my room the other night?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. His smile faltered, and for the first time, he looked uncertain. "Just a colleague," he said quickly, avoiding my gaze. I shook my head. "Don't lie to me." The room fell silent. Then, with a sigh, Arjun sat down beside me. "I never meant to hurt you," he began, his voice low. I made mistakes. I let things get too far." His words felt like a confession, though he never explicitly admitted to the betrayal I already knew in my heart. The connection I'd cherished was nothing more than a facade, a carefully constructed illusion. "I trusted you," I said, my voice trembling. "Was any of it real?" He looked at me then, and for the briefest moment, I thought I saw regret in his eyes. But it wasn't enough. Whatever we had, whatever I thought we had, was gone. As he left the room, the door clicking shut behind him, I was left staring into the empty space where he'd stood, my heart heavy with the weight of a shattered trust. The silence after Arjun's departure was deafening, a stark contrast to the warmth he'd once brought into the room. In the days that followed, the weight of his betrayal settled over me like a heavy fog. I replayed every conversation, every lingering glance, and every touch, searching for signs I had missed. How had I let myself fall so deeply for someone who had only been pretending? Grief turned to anger, and anger gave way to self-doubt. I questioned my own judgment, wondering if I had been foolish to believe in the connection we shared. But as I stared out the window of my hospital room, Watching the world continue as though nothing had changed, I realized that wallowing in regret wouldn't heal me. I began to focus on my recovery, determined to reclaim the parts of myself I had lost in the whirlwind of my feelings for Arjun. The nurses, sensing my withdrawal, offered small acts of kindness, a warm smile, an extra blanket, or a few encouraging words. Slowly, I allowed their compassion to chip away at the bitterness in my heart. One day, while flipping through a book a nurse had lent me, I came across a line that struck me deeply. The hardest lessons are the ones that teach us who we truly are. I closed the book and let the words sink in. This experience, as painful as it was, had revealed truths about myself that I couldn't ignore. I had been searching for something, validation, connection, perhaps even love, in a place where it couldn't truly exist. Arjun's betrayal had hurt deeply, but it wasn't the end of my story. It was a chapter, one that would shape the person I was becoming. As my physical health improved, so did my resolve. I signed up for a support group for people recovering from emotional trauma, seeking solace in the stories of others who had faced their own betrayals. In their experiences, I found strength and solidarity, realizing that my pain was not unique, and neither was my resilience. Months later, I left the hospital, stepping into the world with a renewed sense of purpose. I carried scars, both physical and emotional, but they no longer defined me. Instead, they served as reminders of my strength and the lessons I had learned. Though I hadn't seen Arjun since that final conversation, I no longer felt the need for closure. His choices were his own, and they no longer had the power to dictate my happiness. I had reclaimed my story, and it was no longer one of betrayal but of survival and growth. As I walked through the hospital doors for the last time, the sun warmed my face, and I smiled, a genuine smile that came from within. This was my new beginning, and I was ready to embrace it. For the first time in a long while, I felt free.